Bill Welter, welcome to Ordinary Visionaries.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for taking the time to do this, and I look forward to this conversation. So tell me, Bill, how are you an ordinary visionary?
Well, actually, your question of an ordinary visionary was kind of intriguing because I'm not a person who thinks about big things from the future and all things like that. But let me tell you my story. And
Yeah.
here's my story. I'm going to give it to you short and sweet. Um, I dropped out of college and went into the Marine Corps, and fortunately, I had an opportunity to go to officers candidate school, and I ended up spending 5 years in the Marine Corps. But
Wow.
here's the visionary piece on this one. Um, when I got through officers candidate school, so I spent part of my time enlisted, had a chance to go to OCS, went to OCS, and when I'm getting now to become a brand new brown bar second lieutenant, my parents and my fiance, who's now been my bride for 58 years,
Wow.
um, came to my commissioning. And my dad, who had been a World War II sergeant, I thought is going to give me a snappy salute because I now outrank the old Sarge. Well, instead, the old Sarge realizes he's my dad. He starts poking his finger into my chest. And he says, "Your only job is to take care of your troops, and they'll take care of you." That is the best advice I ever got
Hmm.
regarding leadership in my life. Um, it got me through Vietnam. It got me through corporations. It got
Hmm.
anyway. It's take care of your troops is the kind of thing that's sitting out there, and then the question becomes
Yeah.
one of, so how do you do that? You know, it's 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 just amazing to me. How do you do that? So I'll tell you another part of my story. The other part of my story is during I spent a bunch of years in the consulting world, and at one point in time, I'm sitting in a conference room and I'm looking at the people across the table from me. And I'm thinking to myself, she's got an MBA from Stanford. He's got an MBA from Harvard. They are smarter than me. Why do they need help?
Good
And then
question.
the next question, next day or so, I came across the quote from Louis Pasteur, the French microbiologist. He dealt with anthrax, he dealt with rabies, he dealt with silkworm disease. He was accused of being lucky, and at one point he said, "Yeah, I was lucky, but I was ready for it." And the question there is chance. French to English is chance favors a prepared mind. And
Yes.
so I started wondering, what the heck is a prepared mind? And I start looking at the people who are prepared for their future. And part of the issue of leadership, from my perspective, is we got to get through all the junk of today and help our organizations get into the future. Um, so that got me kind of on a journey for a little while, looking at skills, because it didn't seem to be to me it was an issue of people who are smarter, that knew more. It was questions of how they acted and what they did in their roles. And I came across a handful of skills that I thought made the difference between people who were prepared and not, and therefore bringing their organization along with them. And I was doing a workshop with a friend of mine who was a professor at Northwestern University at the time, and she said, let's put on a workshop with this stuff, and that led to a contract for a book, and that led to a book from Louis from Josie Bass about the prepared mind of a leader.
Hmm.
And when we first put this thing together, the editor of Josie Bass said, um, "You got to put this into the leadership area." And I said, "Well, wait a minute. This is just skills that people need." She said, "The only spot in our catalog is leadership, so make it a leadership book." Yes, yes, ma'am. I can do that. So
You want to
the
get published?
I want to get published. Um, and so then we started looking at the issues of leadership, and the kind of the issues of leadership are simply it's people who work outside of the confines of their job description to help their organization.
Hmm.
That ties quite well into the question of being prepared for the future, because the future keeps changing on us, and I think we are unprepared. Now, I'm going to make off one. I'll hold your comments for a second, or questions for a
Sure,
second.
sure.
Here's where I've made my living for oh my God, since 2000 or so. So 25 years. It's in middle management, because from my
Mm,
consulting days, I used to sometimes go into some places and think about, you talk to the middle managers long enough, they know what to do.
mm.
They don't get hurt. And so my
Because they're
ordinary,
closer to the leading edge of what's happening, right?
oh my gosh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they're
They're working with the workers who are producing the work.
if I
Yeah,
put it in a military metaphor, I would say these are the people who've got their boots on the ground.
yeah,
And when it comes to leading an organization, you can be the general who sits in the ivory tower and looks at paper, but it's the people who have got their boots on the ground that make it happen. So that's where I've made my living for a bunch of years, is working for middle managers and helping them think about the future and get ready for it. And there are some. The book dealt with 8 skills, obvious skills. I mean, every time I've done a workshop, and I've done a couple hundred of them, I'll do a workshop on the skills, and then I'll say, "Hey, these are pretty obvious, right?" And then people will say, "Yeah, they are. They're really obvious." The next question is, which ones aren't used here? And globally, I mean, I've done workshops in Europe, and I've done workshops in South America and in the United States and in China and in Singapore.
yeah. Wow.
Globally, the answer that I get is, we don't imagine enough, we
Mm,
don't reflect enough, and we don't challenge enough.
mm.
And if I said, you've got to have an imagination, people would say, "Yeah, of course, yeah, obvious," but we don't do it. But we don't do it. And the observing thing, that was so our recent bout with COVID had me on a just I was going crazy, because this was one of those things. It had been talked about. We had we should have been ready, and we weren't. Corporations weren't. Governments clearly weren't.
Yeah.
Um, and that got me back to thinking about, the skill of observing is not just thinking about what's happening in the middle of your radar screen. It's about what's happening on the edge of the radar screen. And the edge of the radar screen, if you went back to 2018, there had been 10 epidemics around the world. And collectively, the leaders of the
From
world
from
said,
2018 to 2020.
2018 to 2020, there had been 10 epidemics around the world.
Wow.
SARS and Zika and MERS and all, collectively, the leaders of the world basically said, "Oh, germs will never get on an airplane. They'll never come here." Well, sorry, germs get on airplanes along with their people. So we didn't observe well, and there's a whole bunch of things that I would say we would do. So this is a very long answer to your short question. The way I try to help literally middle managers and emerging leaders is to get them to think more about their future and learn how to anticipate. And then the flip side of that is, once you've done this cool thinking stuff,
Yeah.
is get them to realize, I don't care if you're high on the org chart and you make all the money, you need a team. And if you can't enable your team, you ain't going to get it done. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
So anyway, that's where I rant and rave about.
So a couple questions for you. When did you write your book?
It came out in 2006.
2006. Okay. And you had already been doing workshops at that point, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So when was it that you formulated those top principles, and how did you come to those? And I ask that as someone who taught people for a long time and was always looking at marketing principles and creating models for them and And I always think that's an interesting process because you're trying to get to what's there that people are missing. What's there that's really important that people don't have a clue about, and you mentioned those three things.
Yeah.
So how did those evolve where you went, it's never one thing at a time, I suppose. It takes a while. But how did those evolve so that you could really emphasize those things? And my sense is those things were really well received and very effective.
That's a really interesting question about the evolution. So let me go back and tell you another story, because I think this was one of those. It was a pivotal point, but I didn't realize it until decades later.
Hmm.
And so one of the issues of, you've got to, if you see something that's happening and you've got to take some action on it, came actually when I was getting ready to go to Vietnam. And there, where I was, like everybody else, going through training. And this particular day was an issue on talking about ambushes, ambush techniques, and all the rest of that stuff. And one of the young sergeants asked the gunny. He said, "Gunny, what happens if we got caught in an ambush?" And the gunny simply looked at him and said, "Move." Fast. And then the gunny said, "And I can't tell you whether you move left, right, forward, or back, because your feet are on the ground. You have to do it. But I'm telling you, you got to move." And when you think about what's going on in the world of business, I'll leave it with business for the time being. I think we spend too much time studying things, and we don't experiment enough, and we don't move quick enough. So that was a pivotal point where I got to think in terms of, not only do you have to be quick about it, but wouldn't it be smart if I could see clues ahead of time about the ambush? The wire across the trail, or whatever the case may be. But there's got to be some clues that are sitting out there, and that got me thinking about the issue of clues and paying attention to what's not obvious to us. The other thing that made a big difference in my ability, the creation of this framework, was the years I spent in consulting. Consulting I spent 5 years in the Marine Corps, 5 years doing honest to God engineering. I'm very comfortable inside of a factory. And then I went over to consulting, and I spent 20 some years doing consulting, a couple of versions of it. One is operations consulting, another part was business consulting. The beauty of consulting, though, is that you get a chance to stand on the sidelines and watch an organization. And
from a sort of objective point of view, as opposed to being in the weeds.
Right. And, and you're at that point, you're sitting there and you're thinking about, I wonder why they're doing this, or wonder why they didn't do that. So one of the things that came out of the consulting world, and I remember talking to one of the guys that I worked with was just an old factory guy, really comfortable inside of, he knew how to deal with machinery and everything else. And this one particular company we went into, and we were talking about some of their quality problems. And Frank just, I could see he was thinking. And I said, "Well, Frank, what's on your mind?" He said, "The quality problems are simply because they don't maintain their machines well enough." So how do you know they don't maintain their machines well enough? He said, look at the grease on the floor, look on the oil on the floor. Things are leaking. And they should have been doing preventive maintenance. He said, and I'll bet you somewhere along the line, somebody said, "Oh, we should save some money and hold off on the preventive maintenance for this year." He said, there's the clues. And so I got trained by this old factory rat to basically walk through a factory and look for clues. What's going on here? And, he every now and then he'd walk into an area and he'd put his finger across something and he'd look at how much dust was on or dirt or grime was on his finger. And I could just watch his mind going. And it was just clicking through. And he was looking for patterns at that point in time. So the consulting world helped a lot.
That whole area is interesting to me. That are things orderly? Are they organized? Are there systems? Do people follow the systems? Or is the place chaotic? and
Yeah.
it takes some discipline and time and training to get to systems and, follow the systems. And then, anyway, but those are things you can see, which is pretty interesting.
And it is. And then
Yeah.
part of the issue there. So I'll go back to one of the things that's missing. We don't challenge enough. And the issue of challenging, I think, for leaders is that it's really easy for somebody who's a leader to challenge his workforce. It is very difficult for some senior leaders to be challenged. And they don't like that. And an awful lot of them just kind of shut down, and I remember this one consulting assignment I had, the vice president of finance was he was bragging about how my office is always open, blah, 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 blah. And I talked to one of the middle managers. I said, hey, he says his office is always open. And he said, yeah, but we're afraid to walk in there because, because he says, you can walk in there, but if you tell them bad news, we're screwed. And so, the flip side to challenging is to the willingness and the ability to be challenged. And that is so difficult for a lot of, I teach this stuff. I hate it when somebody corrects me, but I'm old enough now to where I just shut up and let them correct me. And it's that.
So, in your workshops, your programs, what was the format of those? Was it long term, short term?
The here's the challenge of working with large corporations is they want to turn everything into an event. And so the sweet spot for me for a while was to be able to put on 2-day in-depth workshops and really dig into problems. And then somewhere along the line, we kind of fell in love with this term of, let's get lean, let's get mean, let's do more with less. And they cut budgets and they say, can you take your workshop and bring it down to 1 day? Yeah, but we're not going to have as deep a conversation in it. And then
No.
it's even get worse than that. So part of it is we try to in the area of being cost efficient, we lose effectiveness for an awful lot of organizations. But coming back to your question, the best thing I ever had, and it only happened to me once, was an executive of one of the large fast food companies said, can you take my team for the next month or so and run a book project? Have them read something, and then once a week we're going to get together and talk about it. That was a sweet spot. That was really good because we spent a little bit of time talking about theory and a lot of time talking about application.
Right.
And so, yeah, I would love to be able to draw things out. And, the learning should not be an event. It should be a process where people apply
Yeah.
it on a day-to-day basis.
My most effective program was my 1 year program.
Oh, yeah.
And we met twice a month as a group virtually.
Yeah.
And twice a month with individual people in the program. My realization was it takes time for people to change.
Oh,
and
my gosh, yes.
Information is really important. But you give someone some information and just sort of let it sit there, it doesn't get applied. So you have to give exercises and you have to go deep on it. Anyway, so let's get into some of your core principles that are so important in leadership. Now, I know there's 727, but I collect ideas and systems, and I'm working on something right now like that. The qualities of an ordinary visionary, and that keeps evolving. And how many qualities are there? Well, I don't know. Which is the most important? I don't know. So, and what's the order in which you have to learn them? Who knows? But all of these things are important. And it's worth looking at all of these different things. So where do you start? Maybe it's that when your father said to you, take care of your troops.
Could be. Could be. Yeah.
It's about taking care of your people, not ordering people to do shit.
Oh, that's absolutely one of the key pieces that are sitting out there.
Yeah,
So let me back off and tell you a little bit more of my story of the book.
sure.
The book. Um, so I got the contract with Josie Bass somewhere in, I don't know, 2005, I think it was, and they gave us a year to write the book. And so my friend Jeannie, who's the professor, because when I got the contract, I went to her and I said, Jeannie, I need some intellectual rigor here. You got to help me. And and then I said, by the way, I already have a contract. She jumped on. So, but we wrote a good portion of the book, and I went to a friend of mine who was a senior partner of one of the big consulting firms. Actually, I was in that consulting firm at one point in time, and he was such a good friend that one day I just went into his office. I said, "Hey, Mac, fire me. I'm not happy." And as a good person, he said, "Okay, Willie, you're fired in 6 months. Now let's get you out of here." Anyway, I went back to Mac. I gave him the draft of the book, and he said I met him a few days later, and he said, "Interesting, interesting. So what?" I said, "What do you mean, so what? This is important stuff. How are you going to use it?" Oh, and that got us into this interesting conversation about the 4 basic responsibilities of anybody in a leadership position. I mean, I don't care whether it's a first line supervisor or it's the CEO of PepsiCo.
Right.
It's the 4 basic responsibilities. Number 1, you got to sense some signals of change. What's going on in my world that's changing? Number 2, you got to make sense of that. You got to spend some time thinking. 1 and 2 are all thinking things. Number 3, you better make a decision or a set of decisions. And number 4, you better work on them. And it's a cycle.
Yeah.
And it happens again and again and again and again. And sometimes it's slow and sometimes it's fast. And then sense, make sense, decide, act. That forms a cycle. Within that, on the sensing part, the question that I always ask people is, what's on the edge of your radar screen and coming in fast? Because if I use the metaphor of a radar screen, they can tell me every problem that they have today. I mean, we could chapter and verse, we could talk about all your problems. But if you're going to tell me about what are problems are you anticipating 2, 3, 4 years from now, that's kind of on the edge of the radar screen.
Yeah.
So one of the principles is
everybody these days is thinking, how are we going to implement AI?
Wow.
What's happening with AI? It's the big, anyway.
Yeah. Oh boy, you and I could have a great conversation on this one. But so one of the questions there of thinking in terms of what's on the edge of the radar screen is you got to kind of figure out, what could this thing be? And this is the tough part. Now you got to make some sense, because so you sense, then you make sense. I've got all these clues. What are they telling me? What's going on here? And I could be an engineer on you in terms and say, well, you got to create a hypothesis. What you got to do is guess. You got to make a guess. Here's where I think this is going to go.
Yeah.
And if you wait too long, then you're going to be back in the middle of the radar screen, because you're going to be in the reaction zone. Somebody's going to get there first, and they're going to deal with it, and now you got to react to whatever else is going on.
Right.
So one of the principles there of the sensing piece is always pay attention to the edge of the radar screen. This came to me, oh my gosh, 30 some years ago. I was doing some consulting work in a small factory, family-owned business on the west side of Chicago. And I walked into the owner's office one afternoon, and I just looked down at his calendar while I was talking to him, and I said, "Hey, John, you're going to the library on Friday. What are you going to the library for?" He said, "I got to think about the business." And I said, "Library, why don't you just shut your door?" He said, "Come on, you know this place. If I shut my door, somebody's going to open my door to ask me why I shut my door. So I go to the library." And I said, John, why did you schedule it? And here was the brilliance. His answer was, if I don't schedule it, I won't do it.
Right.
I'm too stinking busy to think about the future unless I schedule time to think about the future. For 20 years, I've been telling middle managers, find some time, carve it out, and think about the future. Get a cup of coffee, go off into a corner someplace, but ponder the future. We have no choice but to do that. It happens for business. It happens also on a personal basis. I had a friend of mine not too long ago. I'm an official old guy. So if I tell you I'm a Vietnam veteran, you can start adding up the years.
Right.
I had a friend of mine call me a few years ago, and he said, "Hey, Will, we're old." I said, "No kidding." He says, "I'm not ready." I said, "What do you mean you're not ready? I can't retire. I didn't save enough money."
Oh,
Oh, well, had you thought about the future when you were a 30 something or a 40 something, you could have been ready. So thinking about the future happens for business, and thinking about the future happens for people in general.
yeah.
That's one piece. Making sense, that's all about really good thinking, but I'll tell you one key piece on that one. It's pay attention to the assumptions that you're making. And the metaphor that I use is that assumptions are the high blood pressure of strategy. High blood pressure is, we don't know if we have high blood pressure,
Right.
until the nurse puts a cuff on our arm and says, "Oh my God, lay down," or until we have a heart attack, or until we have a stroke, and then people say, "Oh, it was high blood pressure. It was the silent killer." Bad assumptions are the silent killers of corporate strategies, and therefore, from a leader's perspective, I think part of the issues of leaders need to do is they need to kind of constantly say, "What's going on?" and do, even if it disagrees with what I'm thinking about, what's going on.
Yeah. I want to drill down into that a bit because are there particular kinds or categories of assumptions that are really common? For instance, I just came back from the doctor and had my yearly checkup and, asking all these questions and, your blood pressure, this, that, and the other thing. But, have you checked this? And if you're healthy, feeling healthy, you assume you're healthy. And I would guess that that's kind of, well, we're profitable, it's okay. But what are we missing? Where are the blind spots? So we're assuming stuff that maybe really isn't true because we haven't looked deep enough. We haven't analyzed it or whatever.
Wow, good question. Here's what popped into my mind when you said that. Years ago, I did some work with a professor at DePaul University who was a finance professor. And if we went into a business, he said, "I want to see 10 years of financial data." And I said, "What do you want to see the 10 years for?" He goes, "I want to look at trends that can't keep going on. So if the cost trend keeps going up and the revenue trend is flat," he says, "they're going to intersect one of these days, and that's a bad thing. We don't want that."
Yeah.
So one of the things that to your question of assumptions that you have to look at, I think you have to look at some of the assumptions that are underlying the fundamentals of your income statement and your balance sheet, and ask yourself, what's weird here? What doesn't look right? Although last year might have been good, but what's the trend? Is it unsustainable at this point in time? And the other thing is, I would yeah, here's one that I'm doing some work for the Small Business Development Center here in Northern Colorado.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of like yeah, I'm an old man, but I'm not retired because I'm giving stuff away at this point in time, so to speak. I mean, anyway. That's beside the point. I'm working
Yeah,
with the SBDC.
I get it.
Um, one of the things that we talked about is, what assumptions are you making about your customers? And here the big issue is they age a day at a time, and all of a sudden they're old, and you don't know that. You wake up and you go, "What the heck happened to them?" I did some work for one of the big pharmacy companies for a bunch of years. And the story that I used to tell was, okay, back in the day, before my mother-in-law passed away, she was living with us. And on Sunday morning, the Sunday paper would show up. I mean, like a real newspaper. And she'd pull out the CVS flyer, and she'd pull out the Walgreens flyer, and then she'd be comparing them. And then I got my marching orders. They're like, oh, Bill, I want you to go CVS and get this. I want you to Walgreens and get that. Okay. Well, to her, that was the way you contacted you. She was contacted. It was through a flyer. And then those went away. And now everything is kind of in a newspaper, but it's not. And I get emails from both of them. And so your customers age a day at a time. The flip side of that is pay attention to the slow change of your workforce. It changes a day at a time. And I think one of the challenges for an awful lot of leaders at this point in time, and we've talked about Gen Z, but now Gen Alpha is on the cusp of coming into the workforce.
That's
And
what they're going to be called, because we all the way to Z, so we start from A.
well, we're getting fancy. We're using the Greek alphabet now. I think it's the alphas.
Yeah, yeah.
So Gen Alpha is the latest ones. They're I don't know, 14 years old, maybe is the oldest of them right now. But if you're thinking about the future, that's where your future workforce is. And they're different again. So as a boomer, as a leading edge boomer, oh my God, these kids are different. But you know what? They're going to win because I'm going to die and they're still going to be around here. And so there you go. So on the assumptions piece, I would pay attention to customers. I would pay attention to my financials. I would pay attention to my workforce. And then on the work, back to my original point of take care of your troops, you can't treat the newer generations the same way that you and I were treated and wanted to treat people. It just, we can fight it if we want to, but it ain't going to work. They're just different. Not better, not worse, different.
Yeah. I don't have a lot of connection with younger people, so what can I say? I'm clueless in that area. Um, are they better educated, worse educated, more aware, more liberal, more conservative? They're obviously they're born with an iPad in one hand and a cell phone in the other hand.
Yeah.
And dealing with that digital world. Yeah, I've never owned an iPhone or a smartphone.
Well, you'll be glad to know that dumb phones.
I live on my
are
iPad.
on their way back.
Really?
Dumb phones are on their way back. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's more and more. Our older son is 52, and he finally gave up. And he said, "Dad," I said, "I'm getting rid of my iPhone. If you want me, I got a plain old everyday phone. That's all it does," because he found it was just wasting his time. So, but let me take you off onto a tangent for a second about young people. And this is an anecdotal story. So take it as an anecdote. It's just, that's what it is.
Yep.
In Fort Collins, Colorado, there is I think it's a charter school or a magnet school or something like that called the Compass School. And the Compass School is their motto is, "We accept you as you are." And this is for some of the kids that are they're out of the mainstream. They're not quite the mainstream. So I went and visited the founder of the Compass School a year or so ago. And I walked in there and I was like, oh my gosh, some of these kids were all in goth, black, everything. And some of the kids were dressed up like a preppy from the 1970s, khaki slacks, polo shirt. And they were buds and they were friends and they liked each other. And it was really, really interesting. And their school is fascinating from another point of view. They don't have a fixed curriculum. They teach competencies. So when it came time for them to study homelessness, they went and interviewed homeless people on the street, 7th graders.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. Anyway, here's the point.
Yeah.
Here's my anecdote and my data point of one. I talked to the founder one day and I said, Jan, I said, tell me about Gen Alpha. And she said, on the one hand, they are totally accepting. They don't care what your religion is, they don't care what your color is, they don't care what your sexual orientation is. They don't care. They accept you as you are. On the other hand, they are incredibly fragile.
Hmm.
And her point was she had kids that said, I just can't take my final exam today because it just doesn't feel right. And and I can imagine having told my parents I'm not going to take an exam today because it doesn't feel right. I would have gotten the sole of my father's boot somewhere. But that's the way they are. Some of them are. Anyway, so they're different. They're different. And not better, not worse, just different.
Yeah. Well, we have to continue with this civilization. And, if you look at I don't know if we really want to go there, but, we've had various points in our American civilization, over my lifetime, from the end of the Second World War to Vietnam. I think of those various presidents, for good or for bad, different emphasis on one political thing or the other, the rise of unions, the fall of unions, coming
Yeah.
back of unions, all of that. But do you still find, amidst all of that, basic leadership skills are still there? I mean, I read philosophy, I read the Stoics. The Stoics were talking about stuff like this, more than 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Some of the best wisdom is the really old stuff from Lao Tzu, and they had really deep insight into human nature that seems to be apart from anything external happening in the world.
Yeah.
Getting along with people, or getting something done, or knowing how to flow with what is instead of resisting, all these kinds of
Yeah.
things.
Well, my hope is that enough of the middle of the world is going to wake up and say, hey, for all of those of you who are overly liberal and for all of those of you who are overly conservative, let's talk. Let's come together. And the problem is I think the middle has not done a good enough job of standing up and trying to bring them together. Um, here's my big concern, frankly, for the United States. And I'll give you two pieces on this one. One of them is I've got a friend who is he's a Harvard educated economist who has a hard time living in the world, so he lives in a YMCA. I mean, but he is
He has
scary.
one room in the YMCA.
That's right. And
Wow.
he
Low overhead.
and he goes to work and he comes back and he reads his books and he's fine. And he's comfortable with that life for himself. But I
Yeah.
talked to him a while back and I said, hey, Paul, talk to me about Congress. And he just kind of got a faraway look in his eyes and he turned to me and he says, the dumbing down of discourse.
No
We
kidding.
don't talk anymore.
No kidding.
We yell at each other, but we don't talk anymore. And I'm concerned that if we can't reinvigorate that issue of talking to one another, I think I'm nervous, to be blunt.
Yeah. I think Twitter was sort of the beginning and the end of that. You could go on and make your voice heard about anything. But before, you used to sort of keep those ideas to yourself and talk to a few people. But you put your idea up, and then 20 people pile on saying you're an idiot, you're a jerk, you're whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just the lowest base common denominator. So no matter what you say, someone attacks you, which is one reason I don't go on social media much anymore. I just said, how does that benefit me?
Doesn't.
So how does that relate to leadership? So in a company, obviously a company is an organism. It's an enterprise trying to produce a result, trying to put a good product or service into the market. And it takes cooperation and thinking and support and all of that kind of thing. Um, Companies can be the greatest communities in the world, and also they can be very toxic.
Yes. Um, and so now I'll go to the question of on leadership at the higher levels of an organization.
Yeah,
They will set the tone as to whether or not we talk or we yell at each other.
yeah,
Um, so over the decades, I've had a chance to talk to a lot of people in a lot of leadership roles. Um, Can I name names?
yeah, sure.
Sure. Okay. So, 20, maybe 20 years ago now, maybe 15, I was doing some work for McDonald's Corporation. And I was doing a workshop on the West Coast for McDonald's West. And the president of McDonald's West was a gentleman by the name of Don Thompson. And he wanted to sit in on the workshop. And I get nervous when the senior executives want to sit in on a workshop because it tends to shut it down. But he said, no, I'm just going to be there as a participant. And he was. And the thing that really, really got me at one point in time, one of the managers that was in the workshop said something that was very critical of Don. And I could see him get kind of lean forward in his chair, and then he sat back and he simply said, "Tell me more. What am I doing?" And he listened, which made all the difference in the world for the rest of the time we were together
Right.
because he listened. And
Yeah.
just a great, anyway, a great guy. I like his attitude. It was good then. I'm sure it's still good now. But I think from a leadership perspective, one of the best things to do is for a person to listen. So let me tell you a story. I'm a storyteller.
Yeah.
Well, a
Great.
bunch of years ago, I was going out to the East Coast to visit a client there, and I realized I was going to be pretty close to a business where I knew one of the executives. So I called her up and I said, "Hey, Sue, haven't talked to you for ages. How about if I pop on in? We have a cup of coffee and we get caught up." And she said, "Oh, great. Why don't you come on in and you can sit in on my surprise me meeting?" I said, "What?" She said, "I'll tell you when you get here." So a few weeks later, I show up, "Hi, how you doing?" Get caught up and all the rest of that stuff. And he says, "Okay, time to come in on the meeting." So we went in there and she sat down at the end of the table. She was pretty high executive. And simply, she had her whole team around this big conference table. And she simply said, "Surprise me." And the job was for people to tell her something about the business that she didn't know.
Yeah.
And I watched the people go, one by one. They might tell her about, "Oh, we got this problem with a supplier," and she said, "Thank you very much, but I'm on top of that one." Or another time, something came up, and she said, "Yeah, I heard about that. I'll have to look into it more." And a couple of times, she said, "I didn't know that." She reached under the table, grabbed a 1 pound bag of M&Ms, and tossed it to the person. And then we did the whole meeting in 20 minutes. And afterwards, I said,
So if
"Sue,
they told about something she didn't know, she gave them a 1 pound bag of
a
M&Ms?
1 pound bag of M&Ms." That she was rewarding them with lots of M&Ms.
Yeah.
And so I afterwards I said, "That was one of the coolest meetings I've ever sat in." And she just she looked at me. She said, she's all these people are talking to customers, they're talking to suppliers. They know things I don't know,
Sure.
and I know I'm going to be surprised in business. And then here was her punchline: "I want to be surprised by my team," which was fascinating to me because she knew she was going to get surprised, but she wanted her team to surprise her. And she didn't, her ego was such that Gee, I didn't know that. And I think it made for a good lesson in leadership for an awful lot of people that were in that room.
Was she the CEO of the company, or who was
No,
she?
she was a vice president.
Okay.
Yeah, but she was up there.
Yeah. So that's a pretty enlightened business practice. I do have a question for you and sort of a comment about business in general. It seems to me that, business has always been revolved around money to a great degree,
Yeah.
obviously. Um, and people get greedy. And, and CEOs are paid umpteen times more compared to the lowest paid employee than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And it seems that the endless chase for more money and to be richer and richer is one of the cancers in our society. But, when you go into a company, it's all about, well, what use are you unless you help us be more profitable, more successful? I mean, and can you have both of them? We want to be successful, but we also want to take care of our employees. We want to take care of the environment. We want to have it be a wonderful place to work.
Yeah.
And, I think there are some companies like that, and you probably know more about those companies than I do because you're more in the corporate world. But how, how can a company find some sanity there? Because I think it's really led to, so we have to pollute a little bit. So, so we've got our effluent flowing into the river. Oh, well,
Yeah.
and ultimately, sometimes these people get caught and get multi-million-dollar fines. And it's sort of like a game of, and then the Republicans want no regulation at all, and the Democrats want a ton of regulation. And there's this thing that I've always wished. Can companies be in business to do good before as a priority over making money? And I'm giving a bit of a speech here, but I'd like to hear your thing. Years ago, there's a guy named Michael Phillips, and he was a sort of a new age kind of business consultant. He says, here's the deal about money. It's a policy that we make a profit, but it's not the purpose of our business. It's just a policy. We have to make a profit or we can't succeed. It's important, but the purpose is deliver goods or services that we love and want to help people with. And maybe companies wouldn't be so ginormous if we had that philosophy, but would that be a bad thing?
First of all, I don't think that would be a bad thing. I think too many of our businesses have gotten too large. And that's another conversation we could have. I want to take you back in history for a little bit.
Yeah.
So right now, if I turned around to my nieces and nephews and I say Sears Roebuck and Company, some of them will say, huh? And some of them will laugh because it's a terrible, it's gone. It was driven into the ground because of the push for profit.
They had their day, I'll tell you.
Oh,
They
so
were the company.
Sears Roebuck and Company was the Amazon of its day.
Yeah.
You could buy a house through the catalog, have it delivered to a lot, and then you'd build your own house from the Sears kit that came along.
Really?
Oh yeah, you could buy a house from Sears. Here's the point of my story. At one point, in the early parts of the 20th century, and even up to the mid parts of the 20th century, they had this amazing thing called profit sharing. So I had an uncle who worked for Sears before World War II, went off to World War II, came back, went back to working for Sears. He spent his entire career selling tires for Sears. That's what he did. He was a tire salesman.
Yep.
When he retired, we knew that Uncle Al was a rich man. And when he retired, he and his bride took a number of world trips. They went to China after it got opened up. They went all over the place.
Wow.
The point was, at that point in time, Sears had this thing called profit sharing, and they shared the profits with the workers. he loved working for Sears, and the fact that he sold tires didn't make any difference to him. He
Sure.
got his fair share.
But he was a part of the enterprise as opposed to an overhead
Yes,
expense, so to
yes,
speak. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, right now, this is if I could go on to a rant about CEO pay, drives me crazy. It means that every one of the things that when Jeannie and I were looking at people who were prepared for the future, they enabled their team. They gave them the resources and the opportunity to succeed. So enablement is a skill, and I think an awful lot of current senior executives have forgotten about the whole issue. They have a team, and it could be 50,000 people, but it's their team, and it's their job to enable them to do good work, and we don't do enough. That's my rant.
Yeah. Well, you see companies like this has come up a lot in ordinary visionaries conversations for some reason. Tesla, you know, obviously a brilliant company so many ways, but you know, he spends $44 billion on Twitter, but then, the next month or two, he lays off 50,000 people from Tesla. And you go, where's the priority here? I mean, obviously, having that much power and that much money, you think somewhat differently. But it doesn't seem the thinking is about let's take care of people
Oh,
instead of conquering the friggin' universe.
right. Yeah. E- Egos have gotten in the way of morality. I think an awful lot of senses. We
Yeah.
want to separate church and state, and we want to have nothing to do with religion anymore. How are we teaching our kids to be moral citizens? I mean, there is. I don't care whether you're Protestant or Jewish or Muslim, or there's a moral code that is needed for as people grow up. And I think we are lacking that moral code in an awful lot of organizations these days.
Yeah, and you can have a solid moral code without a religion necessarily. You really
Yeah,
can.
yeah,
But what's right, what's wrong, what's helping people, and if it's a more selfish, I want to get mine more than anything else.
yeah,
In my business, I had to make money. I wanted to make money. I wanted to have enough money so I could retire. I was lucky enough to succeed at that, which as a one-person business can be kind of tricky. But I was always focused on thinking, how can I help my clients? What can I learn? What can I give them? What ideas can I share with them?
yeah.
In other words, to be valuable. So what can companies do to shift to that kind of mindset of like, our purpose is to be valuable? And my sense is some companies and newer companies are really on board with that. Maybe that's the future.
Boy, I hope so.
Yeah.
I truly hope so. What one of the things that I got out of my time in the Marine Corps was just this realization of we are in all of this together. As a group, we are in, and so right now, if I go to the grocery store and I'll put on a cap and it's got Marine on it, and I can have a young man walk past me and he'll go, "Semper Fi, dude," and I'll just give him a Semper Fi back. We're brothers.
Yeah,
We are
yeah.
brothers
Yeah.
because we've got a common code now, and part of that is it's a military code and all the rest of that stuff. But
Yep.
among other things, we knew damn well that we would take care of each other.
Yeah.
Um, in this world of racial hatred and all the hatred we've got going, it's like I wish more people. I wish we still had the draft. For one reason is I think people sometimes need to get out of themselves and realize we there's a bigger purpose to what's going on. One of the things I've had people say to me, Oh, you were a Vietnam veteran. Oh, I never went there. I didn't get a chance to do that. I was in a different time. My answer is always, for the people who are in the service, we went where they sent us. We did what they asked us to do. And so you learn a kind of a sense of responsibility. And you also realize you can't do it by yourself. We're all the way back to my dad. Take care of your troops and your troops will take care of you. And he was right.
In one of my more recent interviews, he talked about when he got out of school, he went and joined the Peace Corps. So, the draft, the Peace Corps, some kind of national service for a
Yep.
couple years would really be powerful. They talk about it, but to pass that kind of thing, it would be a great thing for the country, I think.
Well, the
To
Peace Corps was
instill
started.
values of community and helping and support and all those kind of things instead of we're trying to get rich and make a buck. At some point, you go into the work world, but
Well, I think the Peace Corps was started by Kennedy, wasn't it? I think.
might have been.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was around that time.
Yeah.
And I think that's when we got um, inspired by a leader who basically says, we've got a bigger purpose. It's not just about us; it's
Yeah.
about the world.
Yeah, well, that was the core thing in his speech. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what can you do for your country?
Yeah,
And
yes, exactly, right on the mark.
but it's the same, if we went into a company, ask not what the company can do for you, but what can you do for the company to make a difference. I mean, it's almost too simple, but it's, almost the most deep, truthful things are very simple. How can you be less selfish and more contributory? How can you make a difference as opposed to complaining all the time that things aren't great, blah, 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 all that
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
And, ordinary visionaries are sort of tapping into those kinds of things. What you're saying is great. I mean, to be a real leader is to take on the team to make a difference and listen and be involved and look towards the future and see what's on the radar. And you get a sense that you're really in the game like a troop of Marines, as
yeah,
opposed to a lot of individuals that are. No, there's a lot of infighting and politics and BS in companies. I sort of picked that up early. I've only had one or two jobs in my life.
yeah.
I've been self-employed since I got out of high school. So something about I just so anyway, all that negative stuff about companies just
Well, I think you've hit a real key point, and the question is how to do it. If we went all the way back to the reason for this conversation was the issue of leadership,
yeah,
and when Josie Bass told Jeannie and I we had to make this a leadership book, we went back to some basic definitions and understandings of leadership.
yeah,
And I don't remember, anyway, I don't remember the exact source, but we came across a definition that basically says for a person to be a leader, it has nothing to do where you are on the org chart. It's how you act. And part of the acting is, and I remember this piece, it's working outside of the strict confines of your job description for the good of the organization. So the kid on the receiving dock in a factory who turns to his boss and says, "Hey, boss, every time we get a shipment in from XYZ, there's some damage in the cartons." The kid's acting like a leader because it ain't his job. His job
yeah,
was to load the truck.
yeah,
And so working outside of the confines of your job for the good of the organization kind of sits there. If we could inspire people to do that, it would be pretty stinking cool. I don't know.
yeah. Well,
Yes.
sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Sounds good to me. Well, Bill, thank you so much for taking this time for this interview. We could talk about this forever, but we can't.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.